Well, I introduced myself. My name is Jeroen Bastiaansen. I'm a PhD student at ITS Leeds. My research focuses on youth mobility and their access to economic opportunities. And I'm here today to present some research I've been working on with Karel Martens for the past couple of years, actually at Radboud University in Nijmegen. Specifically on an accessibility fairness index, an index that helps us to evaluate the, let's say, equitable distribution of accessibility in regions and between regions. It draws on empirical research, on empirical data, but I just heard that it's not useless, so we can continue, I think. Right. First of all, it's an accessibility fairness index, so we have to tell something about fairness in the domain of transport. I keep it very short because this is more on the empirical side. But we start from the notion in this research that a fair society ensures participation to all its members. EA, it's an inclusive society. That doesn't mean that you have to make sure that everyone will participate, but that you at least provide them with the opportunity to participate. Now, accessibility in this sense is a very important element, as it allows people to participate in key life activities, so in activities that are spatially dispersed among over space. So to travel to employment opportunities, to amenities like education, healthcare, and to their social contacts. That also means that insufficient accessibility can exclude people from participation. That's what we see in the spatial mismatch literature and the literature on transport-related social exclusion. And therefore we say that sufficient accessibility, as already was mentioned by Beatrice, actually should be a precondition for fairness in the domain for transport. If you want to know more about the theoretical argumentation for this position, then I refer to Karel's book. But if you want to spend less time and money on that, then just follow these 4 notes. Roughly coming back to a figure that's actually Karel's as well, but just to theorize the relationship between levels of transport, their accessibility, and how that impacts actually the activity participation of people, is that we might say that if people have more transport options available, or if space is in a different way organized, that might affect the level of accessibility of people. We may assume that if apart from walking, cycling, I have also public transport available, a car, then my level of accessibility will go up, the potential to reach activities, and therefore also my actual participation in activities might go up. That might be, for instance, that I reach the job that I want, I can reach a better job, for instance, so a higher wage, for instance, I can work more hours. The other way around will also mean that if my transport options are limited, or if my distance to activities are limited due to the organization of our land use system, then also my level of accessibility will go down, so the potential to reach activities, and that might affect, in the end, my actual activity participation. So I might not be able to reach that job. I might not be able to participate in, to go to education or to healthcare services and so on. It might have severe impacts, as the social exclusion literature shows. Unemployment, deterioration from health and so on, social isolation. As we're talking about sufficient levels of accessibility, we may therefore say that a certain level, there might be a certain turning point basically, where this level of accessibility is so low that it might actually exclude people. And that's therefore the focus of this research. Which people and areas fall below this sufficiency line, below the threshold line basically, where the accessibility levels are so low, they actually exclude people from participation. Now we've been working on an accessibility fairness index, as I said. It's a composite index that brings 2 things together. First of all, the depth of accessibility shortfalls, so the accessibility levels of people and places below the sufficiency line I showed. It's dependent, of course, on the sufficiency line, and it measures how low the accessibility level is of experienced persons. Karel sent me these pictures. I think this is a good way to visualize it. There might be people below, or areas above, I should say, the sufficiency line. They don't have a problem if you regard this from a social exclusion point of view. They don't risk that their participation might be limited, but we're specifically focusing on the places and people below this sufficiency threshold. And then it often it obviously is important to what extent their shortfall, to what extent they fall below the sufficiency line, so how large their shortfall is. A second point is the prevalence of accessibility shortfalls. So it's not just the level of accessibility, but also the number of people that fall below this sufficiency line. And that also determines the weight we give to these positions. So there might be a large group of people above the sufficiency line. There might be groups below that, but obviously from a justice perspective, you might say that we want to focus on the biggest groups below the line, depending on their shortfalls and the type of people that live there, so that are dependent on those levels. Right, for the index we use an income poverty measure from Foster et al. We transformed it into an accessibility poverty measure, an accessibility fairness index, where we focus on the number of people, specifically the people below this sufficiency line, and where we might disaggregate on certain spatial levels. We focus specifically on neighborhoods. We distinguish 3 steps of analysis. The first of all is to measure the level of accessibility, as I said, so specifically the levels throughout the region, and more specifically the ones below the sufficiency line. We focus here specifically on jobs. We have the data for that. It also gives a good proxy for other kind of activities, such as amenities and so on. And because our transport and land use system is mainly, let's say, determined by motorized transport, we first of all focus our analysis on car and public transport. As we know in the literature, a lot of the people that are reliant on public transport accessibility often have lower levels of activity participation and so on. The second step is determine the people at risk. So we focus on the population in the region, but we are mostly interested from the social exclusion perspective on the people that might have to cope with or are dependent on the transport accessibility levels, public transport accessibility levels. We focus specifically in our analysis on the lowest income groups, which are most transit dependent. You could also focus on people that are more dependent on cars, for instance, but it highly relates to income. Use specifically this one in the analysis. And the third point, of course, is to establish the sufficiency lines. Now, as Karel already mentioned, it's very difficult to assess this. I think Amartya Sen already also mentioned that in the literature. Don't focus too much attention on that, because it's very dependent on the situation, on expectations. So what we do is we basically say we need a certain sufficiency line, we need a certain point, a certain threshold for that. So we start from the point that average car-based accessibility in a region should be roughly sufficient for most of the population. Otherwise, they wouldn't use a car, I would say. And based on that average level, we take some threshold levels to determine our sufficiency line on. We do that simply because we lack the empirical evidence between accessibility and activity participation. So we did a case study for the Amsterdam metropolitan area. We plotted for the 190, so that the whole metropolitan area constitutes 190 four-digit postal code areas, four-digit neighborhoods, you could say. And we plotted for the 190 postal code areas their car accessibility based on the number of jobs within 30 minutes travel time. By car in the peak time, so that's the dark blue one, the car accessibility off-peak, and public transport accessibility. Now, we only had data for that in the peak time, not off-peak time. What this graph clearly shows is that my car accessibility is way higher than my public transport accessibility, and off-peak even more, obviously. For public transport, this is a peak time. We may consider, or we may assume that public transport accessibility off-peak would therefore be even lower. So where we want to focus our analysis on, because we derive from this social exclusion point of view, or equity point of view, is that we want to focus first of all on public transport accessibility and groups that are dependent on that. Now we have to derive some, or we have to fix some sufficiency lines, some sufficiency thresholds. As I said, we do that as a certain percentage of the average car-based accessibility line. So for our analysis, we said, okay, we use a 50% accessibility of the average car-based line, and a 40% line, 30 and 20. Arbitrarily selected, but just to have a look at the spatial pattern of accessibility in sufficiency. Just one graph to show why we focus on public transport again. If we look at the 50% sufficiency line, which I just showed, then you see that most of the transport zones fall below that line based on their accessibility level. And also the largest part of the lowest income quintile, which we focus on, was below that line. Now we see that that slowly decreases with a lower sufficiency line, so where the level of accessibility we take as a threshold is lower. But it clearly marks that it is important to focus on public transport. Now our index, we use our index to map the accessibility patterns in the region, in the metropolitan region of Amsterdam. Now perhaps we can switch off the light here in front. Great, thanks. And what this graph basically shows, or what this map shows, is where accessibility levels, so all the blue areas are areas in the region based on car-based and public transport-based accessibility that fall below the sufficiency line, below the 50% line in this case, whilst the white areas are above that line. And more darker based on the lower shortfall and the number of people, the number of low-income households that are dependent on those accessibility levels. Now we clearly see that around the city center is relatively light, although some areas are darker. We have here Amstelveen, that's on the southern part of the city. Why that's darker is because there is a lot of social housing there and relatively low public transport accessibility levels. Now we have some villages over here, so it's the whole metropolitan area, what I said. We have the IJsselmeer over here. So we have Volendam, other kinds of places you don't want to go to. But they have relatively low accessibility levels. And if we analyze the patterns over with lower sufficiency thresholds, we see that slowly the pattern, the white areas, so the areas above the sufficiency line, move to the outskirts of the city, while some areas are getting darker. So for instance, the one here in the south, you see it lightens up. Why is that again? Because they still fall below the sufficiency line, so they have accessibility levels below that line, and they have a big concentration of low-income people that depend on that accessibility level. So this is basically a way to focus, to map the spatial patterns of inequity, of accessibility, and to point out where policy attention should focus on. For instance, in case of investments, so where do we want to invest? That might be specifically in this area, dependent of course on where their jobs are and so on. At the same time, it also helps to assess where we don't want to cut in the system. So we don't want to cut back on public transport somewhere over here, because that might affect the situation even more. Now we did the same kind of analysis, and you already saw this picture in Thessaloniki, I think. Is it an urban or a rural phenomenon? So what is the problem basically? I think I still need the light switch off, sorry. Yeah. And what we basically see is with the 50% sufficiency threshold, we see that the contribution of that, the type of areas basically below that line, is at 35% roughly, is highly urbanized, and a bit lower, moderately urbanized. So mainly urbanized areas that contribute to the areas that fall below the sufficiency line. Now we did the same thing for the 40% line, the 30 and the 21. And every time you see this pattern that mostly the highly and moderately urbanized areas contribute to, well, let's say the most inequitable distribution of accessibility. So they are all below, every time below the accessibility line, simply because public transport is relatively poor there, even in the outskirts of the city, and we have this big concentration of low incomes. Then I come to the conclusions. We see, therefore, that insufficient accessibility is not per se a rural phenomenon. Of course, we have low levels of public transport services, for instance, there. And we do have people living there that are dependent on that and might be excluded. But the concentration of people in those areas is relatively low. And as Karel already pointed out in an earlier presentation, we should focus first of all from a justice perspective on the biggest groups that are below the sufficiency threshold. Therefore, we need to concentrate our policy attention, investments in these areas, so basically in the outskirts, in the low-income areas of the city. And obviously, we need some additional analysis, both quantitatively. We used job accessibility, but overall job accessibility as a proxy. But for low-income people, obviously, we need to focus on low-skilled jobs. And the same goes for the qualitative analysis. So we need to know more about this relationship between accessibility, employment outcomes. We might want to diverge between what can I reach within walking distance, within cycling distance, and so on. To what extent this also affects the level of accessibility of people. Right?